a doctor refused to attend to a poor pregnant woman. The next morning, as he left for work, he turned pale upon finding a baby at his doorstep. Dr. Henry Weston lived by a clockwork routine, waking up every day at precisely 6 a.m. His mornings were spent with a cup of strong black coffee in one hand and a medical journal in the other, skimming through articles before heading to the hospital. His home mirrored the precision of his life, large, spotless, and impeccably organized, yet devoid of warmth. It was a house filled with order, but the kind of order that felt cold and uninviting, where every object had its place but lacked any real purpose beyond function. Silence reigned within those walls, a silence that Henry had grown accustomed to, even if it sometimes felt like a reminder of everything missing. At the hospital, Henry was known as a surgeon of exceptional skill, a man who thrived in the controlled environment of the operating room. He moved through the corridors with a sense of purpose, exchanging brief nods and perfunctory greetings with colleagues who admired his professionalism but found him distant. His presence at community events, while expected, was marked by the same sense of detachment. He would attend charity dinners and hospital fundraisers, offering polite smiles and measured conversations, never lingering long enough to form genuine connections. To many, he appeared as an untouchable figure, accomplished, composed, but always apart from the crowd. Yet, despite the discipline and structure of his life, a quiet emptiness lingered in the background, like a shadow he couldn't shake. Late at night, when the city outside his window was still, he would find himself pouring a glass of whiskey and staring into the darkness, wondering if this was all there was. He told himself that he didn't need anything more than his career, that the respect he commanded was worth the loneliness. But in those moments of solitude, even Henry couldn't fully convince himself. He had built his life around control, distancing himself from others to avoid disappointment, but he couldn't ignore the creeping feeling that, somewhere along the way, he had lost something important. One afternoon at the hospital, during a rare break between surgeries, Henry found himself sharing a cup of coffee with Sarah, a fellow doctor known for her easygoing nature and empathy towards patients. Sensing his aloofness, she teased him gently, saying, "Henry, do you ever wonder if a little kindness might do you some good? A simple act could change everything, you know." He responded with a faint, dismissive smile, brushing off her suggestion. "I don't have time for sentimentality, Sarah. People need results, not warm feelings," he replied, his tone sharp but not unkind. Sarah sighed, giving him a look of both pity and understanding, before adding softly, "One day, you might realize that there are things money and success can't buy." Her words lingered in the air as she walked away, leaving Henry with a rare sense of unease. That night, as he sat in his empty living room, Sarah's words echoed in his mind, refusing to be drowned out by the usual hum of his thoughts. He tried to dismiss them as trivial, a simple chat with a colleague, but they stirred something deeper, a vague sense of dissatisfaction he couldn't quite place. He reasoned that he had chosen this path for a reason, to stay focused and efficient, but now a tiny crack seemed to form in that certainty. He brushed it off, yet the questions Sarah had posed lingered, nudging at the walls he had carefully built around himself. It was the first time in years that Henry allowed himself to consider that perhaps, just perhaps, he had been missing out on something far greater than he had ever realized. That evening, as Henry left the hospital, he was approached by a young woman standing near the entrance, her posture tense and uncertain. Her clothes were worn, and her eyes carried a desperate plea. "Drive Weston, please, I need your help," she began, her voice wavering. Henry paused, turning to face her, noticing her rounded belly. She was heavily pregnant. Emma, as she introduced herself, explained that she recognized him from community events and knew he was a well-regarded surgeon. She spoke of her struggles, emphasizing that she had nowhere else to turn for help. Henry listened with a detached expression, already considering the complexities of her request. "Do you have insurance or any way to pay for the care?" he asked bluntly. Her face fell as she shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I have nothing left, nowhere else to go," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. Henry sighed, the walls he had built over the years rising within him. "I'm sorry, but without compensation, I can't help you." "Maybe a local clinic can assist," he replied, his tone firm and final. Emma turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped, and Henry watched her retreat into the night. A strange unease crept into his chest, but he quickly brushed it aside. "I did what I had to do," he muttered to himself as he got into his car, trying to convince himself that he had made the right decision. Yet, her despairing eyes lingered in his thoughts. At home, Henry poured himself a glass of whiskey, hoping it would ease the discomfort gnawing at him. He sat in his darkened living room, replaying the encounter in his mind, unable to shake the image of Emma's broken expression. The silence of his home, usually comforting, felt oppressive tonight. For the first time in years, doubt began to creep through the cracks of his carefully guarded world. Henry spent the entire night turning in his bed, trying to silence the uneasy feeling that lingered after his encounter with Emma. He replayed their conversation in his mind, struggling to justify his decision. The memory of her desperate face haunted him, contrasting sharply with the image of her at community events, always with a shy smile and a hopeful demeanor. Now, that hope had been replaced by despair, and Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he had played a part in extinguishing it. He told himself that he wasn't responsible for the hardships of others, yet the thought kept gnawing at him. The next morning, he rose earlier than usual, hoping a busy day at the hospital would distract him. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with more care than necessary, but his mind was elsewhere. As he drove to work, he glanced at the empty passenger seat, a strange weight pressing on his chest. "I can't save everyone," he muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But deep down, he wondered if it was true, or if he was simply using it as an excuse to avoid getting involved. Throughout the day, Henry found himself snapping at his colleagues, frustration bubbling beneath his composed exterior. Sarah noticed his unusual mood and gave him a curious look, but he brushed off her concern. "Just tired, that's all," he said curtly, trying to focus on the tasks at hand. But every time he found a moment of quiet, Emma's face crept back into his thoughts, making him question the rules he'd lived by for so long. He tried to drown out the doubt with work, but the unease refused to leave. By evening, the weight of his decision felt heavier than ever. He sat alone in his office, staring at a patient chart, but the words blurred before his eyes. Henry leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, wondering why he couldn't just let this go. He had built his life around the idea that emotional distance was necessary for his success, that empathy was a luxury he couldn't afford. But now, he wasn't so sure. A nagging voice inside him whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all this time. When he returned home, the silence of his house was almost unbearable. He poured another glass of whiskey, hoping it would offer the clarity he sought, but all it did was amplify the conflict swirling inside him. As he sat in the dimly lit living room, he realized that his encounter with Emma had stirred something deep within, a discomfort he couldn't ignore. For the first time, Henry found himself questioning the choices that had defined his life, wondering if he had let his own fear of vulnerability close him off to something more. And that question, he knew, wouldn't be answered easily. The next morning, as Henry opened his front door to leave for work, he nearly stumbled over a small bundle left on his doorstep. Confusion washed over him as he crouched down to inspect it, revealing a baby wrapped tightly in a simple blanket. Henry's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The baby let out a small cry, and Henry instinctively picked him up, feeling the unexpected weight settle in his arms. He glanced around the empty street, but no one was in sight, only the quiet morning and the mysterious child now in his care. His thoughts spun wildly as he carried the baby inside, his normally ordered life thrown into sudden chaos. He searched the blanket for any clue, a note, a name, anything that might explain how this child ended up on his doorstep. But there was nothing. Henry's heart pounded in his chest, a strange mix of anxiety and curiosity taking hold. He placed the baby gently on the couch, pacing back and forth, unsure of what to do next. The baby's innocent eyes followed his every move, as if sensing his confusion. The hours that followed were a haze of uncertainty. Henry called into the hospital, informing them he'd be absent, something he never did. He had no idea how to care for a baby, so he turned to his phone for answers, searching for instructions on feeding and soothing an infant. The baby cried often, and Henry's attempts to comfort him were awkward and clumsy. He muttered to himself in frustration, "Why would someone leave a baby with me?" The question echoed in his mind, but no answer came. As the day wore on, Henry found himself staring at the baby more than once, trying to piece together the mystery of his arrival. Who would abandon a child like this, and why leave him at Henry's door of all places? He couldn't help but feel a strange sense of responsibility toward the little one, even if he had no idea how to fulfill it. Every time he considered calling the authorities, something held him back, perhaps the way the baby clung to his finger or the quiet sense of calm that settled over the house whenever he managed to lull the child to sleep. By the time night fell, Henry felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The presence of the baby had turned his carefully controlled world upside down, and though he still had no answers, he knew he couldn't just turn away. As he held the baby close, watching the child's tiny chest rise and fall with each breath, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. But amid the uncertainty, he felt a flicker of something new, a sense that this unexpected arrival might lead him down a path he never anticipated, toward answers he had yet to uncover. In the first few days, Henry found himself overwhelmed by the sudden responsibility of caring for the baby. He struggled with even the simplest tasks, changing diapers, warming formula, and trying to soothe the child's constant cries. His frustration mounted until, out of sheer desperation, he called Sarah, the one colleague he knew might offer some guidance without too many questions. Sarah was surprised to hear from him, but when she arrived at his doorstep and saw the baby in his arms, she raised an eyebrow. "So, Henry, when did you become a babysitter?" she asked, half joking, half curious. Henry shrugged, trying to keep his tone light. "It's complicated," he replied, avoiding her gaze as he handed over a bottle. Sarah took the baby in her arms with a natural ease, calming him within moments. "This little one needs a lot of care, Henry," she said softly, glancing at him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Do you know anything about him? Where he came from?" Henry shook his head, a shadow of uncertainty crossing his face. "No, and I haven't figured out what to do next. I just know I couldn't leave him there." Despite his initial reluctance, Henry found himself relying on Sarah's help more and more. She visited frequently, teaching him the basics of caring for a baby and offering advice on what supplies he'd need. With her support, Henry slowly adjusted to the new routine, waking up in the middle of the night to feed the baby, learning to distinguish the different cries, and even finding a rhythm in their unexpected life together. The child, who he began calling Lucas, had a way of bringing a strange, unfamiliar warmth into the cold corners of Henry's home. As the days turned into weeks, something shifted inside Henry. He noticed how Lucas's small hands clung to his shirt when he rocked him to sleep and how a smile would spread across the baby's face whenever Henry managed to make him laugh. Each little milestone, Lucas's first gurgles, the way he grasped Henry's finger, felt like a victory. It was unlike anything Henry had experienced before, a sense of connection that made him feel both vulnerable and unexpectedly fulfilled. He caught himself wondering if this was what he had been missing all along. Sarah's presence became a comforting constant as well, and Henry found himself looking forward to their conversations, even when they were about diapers and baby food. One evening, as they sat together in the living room with Lucas asleep in the crib nearby, Sarah glanced at Henry with a gentle smile. "You know, you're not half bad at this, Henry. Maybe this little guy is what you needed to soften that heart of yours." Henry tried to brush off her comment with a laugh, but deep down, he couldn't ignore the truth in her words. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something larger than himself, even if he didn't fully understand what it meant. In the following weeks, Henry and Lucas settled into a new rhythm, one that was far removed from the rigid routine Henry had once embraced. Mornings began with Lucas's cheerful babbling, a sound that Henry found oddly comforting as he made coffee. Instead of heading straight to work, Henry spent time feeding Lucas, changing him, and ensuring he was comfortable. It was a far cry from his former solitary mornings, and though it was challenging, he found himself smiling more than he had in years. Each small success, like getting Lucas to laugh with a silly face, felt like a victory he never thought he'd care about. Henry started taking Lucas out for walks in the neighborhood, a routine that became a small adventure for both of them. On sunny afternoons, he would push Lucas's stroller to the nearby park, where the baby's eyes lit up at the sight of trees swaying in the wind and children playing. Henry would sit on a bench, watching Lucas react to the world around him, feeling an unfamiliar warmth bloom in his chest. It was during these moments that he realized how much joy could be found in simple things, something he'd long forgotten in his race for professional success. Sarah continued to visit, bringing with her a lightness that balanced Henry's seriousness. They often found themselves sharing laughter over Lucas's antics, like when he discovered the thrill of splashing water during bath time or his fascination with Sarah's colorful scarves. One afternoon, as they watched Lucas try to crawl across the living room floor, Sarah teased Henry with a playful smile. "Look at you, Drive Weston, playing on the floor with a baby. Who would have thought?" Henry rolled his eyes but couldn't hide his grin. Yeah, don't get used to it," he replied, though his tone lacked its usual edge. Despite the challenges, Henry began to appreciate the unpredictability that Lucas brought into his life. There were sleepless nights and days when he felt completely out of his depth, but there were also moments that filled him with a quiet sense of contentment. He started keeping a small notebook, jotting down the milestones and funny moments he shared with Lucas, something he never would have imagined doing before. It was as if, with each page, he was capturing a side of himself that had long been buried under layers of ambition and isolation. As time passed, Henry found himself wondering if this newfound happiness could last. He couldn't shake the lingering fear that it might all be taken away, this fragile connection he had formed with Lucas, the unexpected sense of belonging. But for now, he chose to focus on the present, on the sound of Lucas's laughter as he swung back and forth at the playground, on Sarah's easy companionship, and on the way his once empty home felt just a little warmer every day. For the first time in years, Henry allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand what it meant to truly live. One sunny afternoon, Henry sat on a bench in the park, watching Lucas play on a blanket spread over the grass. The sight of the baby reaching out for colorful toys and giggling at the fluttering leaves filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. As he gazed around, he realized how much his life had changed since Lucas's unexpected arrival, no longer ruled by sterile routines but marked by these simple, joyful moments. For the first time, he began to believe that maybe he had found a new purpose beyond the walls of the hospital, a chance to be something more than just a surgeon. But as the afternoon stretched on, a shadow fell over his newfound contentment. When Henry and Lucas returned to the house, they found a figure standing near the front steps, Emma. Her appearance was disheveled, her eyes tired and wary, and Henry's heart leapt into his throat. She looked at Lucas with a mix of longing and regret that Henry couldn't quite decipher. Emma's voice was hoarse when she finally spoke, explaining that she had been following from a distance, making sure Lucas was safe. "I knew you'd take care of him better than I could," she confessed, her words weighted with a deep sadness. Henry felt his mind reel, trying to process what Emma was saying. He struggled to keep his voice steady as he asked, "Why? Why leave him like that, without a word?" Emma hesitated, her hands trembling as she held onto the railing of the steps. "I didn't know what else to do," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I couldn't provide for him, not the way he deserves. And I thought, you seemed like someone who wouldn't turn away from him completely, even if you tried." Her words hit Henry like a cold wave, leaving him speechless. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken truths and regrets. Henry's thoughts churned as he tried to make sense of Emma's motivations, the desperation that had driven her to such a choice. He glanced at Lucas, who was now looking curiously between the two adults, oblivious to the tension in the air. A part of Henry wanted to demand answers, to question every decision Emma had made, but another part recognized the fear and vulnerability in her eyes, emotions that mirrored some of his own hidden doubts. He realized that this was more complicated than he had imagined. For the rest of the evening, Henry wrestled with the implications of Emma's return. The certainty he had begun to feel about his role in Lucas's life now seemed fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. He wondered what Emma's presence meant for the bond he had formed with Lucas, and whether he could trust her intentions. But as he watched her leave, her shoulders hunched with the weight of her choices, Henry couldn't ignore the sense that they were all searching for a way to make things right. And in that shared uncertainty, he glimpsed the possibility of a new chapter, one he wasn't yet sure how to navigate. In the days following Emma's unexpected return, Henry found himself torn between conflicting emotions. Emma continued to linger around, occasionally appearing at the park or outside his home, hoping for a chance to see Lucas. Her presence stirred a tension within Henry, one he couldn't easily dismiss. Each time she appeared, she would beg to spend a few moments with Lucas, her voice filled with a desperate longing that was hard to ignore. Henry struggled to maintain his usual distance, but he couldn't deny the unease that crept into his thoughts whenever he saw her. One afternoon, as Henry sat with Lucas at the playground, Emma approached them again, her face drawn and pale. "Please, Henry, just let me hold him for a moment," she pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. Henry hesitated, glancing at Lucas, who seemed content playing with a small toy. He couldn't help but feel protective, unsure if allowing Emma back into Lucas's life would undo the fragile stability they had found. "I don't know if that's a good idea, Emma," he replied, his voice firm but uncertain. He could see the pain in her eyes, but he also feared the impact of her presence on Lucas. That evening, as Henry shared the situation with Sarah, she urged him to reconsider. "Maybe she just needs a chance to show she's changed, Henry," Sarah suggested gently. "Lucas deserves to know where he came from, and Emma, she's clearly trying to make amends." But Henry remained conflicted, feeling a surge of doubt at the thought of opening the door to someone who might disrupt the life he had worked so hard to build for Lucas. He found himself questioning whether he was doing what was best for the child, or if he was simply afraid of losing what he had come to cherish. The tension only grew with each of Emma's visits, and Henry found himself wrestling with sleepless nights, haunted by the weight of his choices. He knew that Emma had a right to be in Lucas's life, yet the thought of sharing that connection made his chest tighten with anxiety. He feared that allowing Emma too close could unravel everything, but he also feared that keeping her away would be a choice Lucas might someday resent. As he watched Lucas sleep peacefully in his crib, Henry whispered to himself, "What's the right thing to do? Am I protecting him, or am I just protecting myself?" In the quiet hours before dawn, Henry found himself pacing the length of his living room, his mind tangled in uncertainty. He knew he couldn't avoid this decision forever. Emma's determination to be a part of Lucas's life was clear, and Sarah's words continued to echo in his mind, nudging him toward a choice he wasn't ready to make. He looked out the window, catching sight of Emma standing across the street, her silhouette small and uncertain in the early morning light. In that moment, Henry realized that no matter what he chose, their lives had become irrevocably intertwined, and the next step would shape all their futures. After much deliberation, Henry finally relented and allowed Emma to visit Lucas a few times a week. He tried to maintain his distance during these visits, watching warily as Emma held Lucas, her eyes filling with a mix of joy and sorrow each time she cradled him. At first, the arrangement seemed to work, but soon, Henry's unease began to grow. Each time he watched them together, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing something precious, like the bond he'd built with Lucas was slipping through his fingers. Despite Emma's reassurances that she wasn't trying to take Lucas away, Henry couldn't ignore the gnawing fear in his chest. One evening, as they sat across from each other in Henry's living room, Emma opened up about her past. She spoke of the hardships she'd faced, the mistakes she'd made, and the desperation that had led her to leave Lucas on Henry's doorstep. Her voice wavered as she admitted how, during the community events where she first noticed Henry, she had admired him from afar. "I thought you were strong, capable, someone who could give him a better life than I ever could," she confessed, tears glistening in her eyes. Henry listened, his own emotions a tangled mess of guilt, anger, and confusion. Emma's words cut deeper than Henry expected. He felt a wave of shame wash over him as he realized how harshly he had judged her from the start. He had assumed she was reckless, abandoning her child without a second thought, but now he saw the pain and regret that had driven her actions. "I'm not trying to take him away, Henry," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to be a part of his life, to show him that I never stopped loving him, even when I couldn't be there." Her plea hung in the air, leaving Henry feeling exposed and uncertain. That night, after Emma left, Henry sat alone in the dimly lit living room, grappling with a sense of loss that he couldn't quite define. He looked at Lucas, who was sleeping soundly in his crib, and wondered if he had made the wrong choices all along. The walls he had built around himself seemed to close in, and he couldn't escape the weight of his regrets. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge the possibility that his own fears might have kept him from understanding the full story, fears that now threatened to take away the one thing he'd come to cherish most. As the hours crept by, Henry felt the fragility of his new life with Lucas like a thread about to snap. He wondered if he had been too stubborn, too afraid to see beyond his own pain. Emma's presence in their lives had stirred a storm he couldn't control, and now, the future he had envisioned for himself and Lucas seemed uncertain, slipping through his grasp like sand. He stared out into the darkness, questioning if he could find a way to make things right or if he had already lost the battle for the family he never knew he wanted. Henry spent the night in turmoil, sitting in Lucas's room as the baby slept soundly, his small breaths the only comfort in the quiet house. He couldn't shake the fear that had gripped him since Emma's return, a fear that maybe he wasn't enough for Lucas. As he watched over the child, he wrestled with doubts he'd kept buried for years, wondering if his need for control had made him blind to the connections he had been avoiding. By morning, he found Emma waiting outside, her expression uncertain. This time, he invited her inside, and they sat together, sharing an uneasy silence that slowly gave way to honesty. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Emma, her gaze softening, reached out a tentative hand and spoke of her desire to make things right, not just for Lucas but for all of them. Their conversation stretched into the morning, filled with confessions of regret and hopes they'd never voiced aloud. Henry realized that the walls he had built to keep himself safe had also trapped him, preventing him from truly living. As he listened to Emma's story, he saw a reflection of his own fears and a chance to change. When Emma finally left, there was a fragile understanding between them, a sense that maybe they could find a way forward together for Lucas's sake. Watching her walk away, Henry glanced at Lucas, who reached for him with a sleepy smile, and felt a flicker of determination. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he was willing to try, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. Determined to find a way forward, Henry decided to allow Emma to visit Lucas more regularly, under the condition that his well-being would always come first. At first, it was awkward, with Henry keeping a watchful eye during each visit, uncertain of how to balance their new arrangement. But as days passed, he noticed a change in Emma. Her efforts to care for Lucas seemed genuine, her interactions with the child filled with a tenderness that matched his own. Henry couldn't ignore the way Lucas's face lit up when Emma entered the room, and he began to believe that perhaps this could work. Gradually, Emma became more involved in Lucas's daily life. She joined Henry and Lucas on their walks to the park, sitting with them as Lucas played in the grass, her laughter mingling with the child's. Henry found himself relaxing, letting down his guard bit by bit, as they began to share small moments of joy together. He still had doubts, fears that lingered in the back of his mind, but the sight of Lucas thriving helped ease those worries. Henry started to see that he didn't have to view Emma as a threat, but rather as someone who could be part of the new life they were building. One evening, as they sat on the porch after putting Lucas to bed, Henry and Emma talked quietly, reflecting on the journey that had brought them together. Emma shared stories from her past, the struggles she faced, and the hope she had lost along the way. Henry listened, offering pieces of his own story in return, revealing bits of the loneliness that had defined him for so long. It was a tentative truce, a recognition that both of them were trying to make up for past mistakes. Henry realized that this connection, however fragile, was beginning to shift his perspective on what it meant to be a family. Their relationship evolved into a mutual respect, each understanding the other's desire to give Lucas the best life possible. Henry found himself less anxious about sharing the role of a caregiver, recognizing that Emma's presence brought something valuable into Lucas's life that he couldn't provide alone. He saw how Emma's nurturing nature balanced his own structured approach, and together, they created a sense of stability that Lucas seemed to thrive on. It wasn't always easy, and old fears still surfaced, but Henry began to trust in the possibility of this new, unconventional family. As the days went on, Henry started to feel a sense of hope that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He saw glimpses of a future where Lucas could grow up surrounded by love, from both him and Emma, despite their complicated past. It wasn't the life Henry had imagined for himself, but it was one that he was willing to embrace. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe he didn't have to do this alone, and that together, they could create a new beginning for all three of them, a beginning that was no longer defined by fear, but by the possibility of healing and hope. As the weeks went by, Henry, Emma, and Lucas gradually fell into a rhythm that felt both new and strangely natural. Their time together was filled with small, precious moments, meals shared around Henry's once lonely dining table, laughter echoing through the living room as Lucas took his first wobbly steps, and quiet evenings spent watching the sunset from the porch. Henry found himself looking forward to these moments, no longer just tolerating Emma's presence but genuinely appreciating the way she completed their little circle. He had never thought he'd find himself here, feeling a warmth that softened the edges of his old life. One evening, as they sat around the table, Lucas looked up from his plate, glancing between Henry and Emma with a bright smile. "I have a big family now," he declared happily, his words stumbling out with the innocent joy of a child. Henry and Emma exchanged a look, the weight of his simple statement settling over them. For a moment, they were both speechless, caught off guard by the depth of what Lucas had said. But as Henry reached across the table to take Emma's hand, he realized that the boy's words held a truth he had been too afraid to acknowledge: they had become a family, even if it wasn't in the way he had ever imagined. After dinner, as they put Lucas to bed, Emma turned to Henry, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "Thank you, Henry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For taking care of Lucas when I couldn't, and for giving me a chance to be part of his life again." Henry squeezed her hand gently, the words catching in his throat. "You don't need to thank me, Emma. I think we've all saved each other in some way," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. They stood together in the dim light of the hallway, the quiet understanding between them deeper than any apology or explanation could convey. With time, Henry began to feel the weight of his old life lifting, replaced by a sense of purpose he had never known before. He found joy in the smallest things, reading bedtime stories to Lucas, sharing late-night conversations with Emma, even the occasional messes that disrupted his once spotless home. He knew that their journey hadn't been perfect, that there were still challenges to face, but he no longer feared the uncertainty of it all. For the first time, Henry embraced the messiness of love, of family, and the simple happiness that came with watching Lucas grow up surrounded by people who cared for him. On a quiet night, as Henry tucked Lucas into bed and listened to his even breathing, he realized that his life had changed in ways he could never have predicted. He thought back to the man he had been before Lucas arrived on his doorstep, the surgeon who believed that control and isolation were the only ways to avoid pain. That man felt like a distant memory now, replaced by someone who had learned to open his heart, even when it felt like the hardest thing in the world. As he stepped back into the hallway, glancing toward Emma with a grateful smile, he knew that they were building something together that was stronger than anything he could have imagined on his own. Henry watched as Lucas played on a blanket spread out in the park, his tiny hands grasping at the soft grass and colorful toys scattered around him. Emma sat nearby, smiling as she held out a rattle, which Lucas grabbed with a delighted squeal. It was a warm, sunny afternoon, and the gentle breeze rustled the leaves above them. Henry leaned back against a tree, soaking in the moment, feeling a deep gratitude for how far they had come. The doubts and struggles that once seemed insurmountable had led to this simple yet profound peace, and he cherished every second of it. As Lucas babbled happily, shaking the rattle in his chubby hands, Henry and Emma exchanged a quiet, knowing look. They had built something together, something neither of them could have imagined when they first met. Emma reached over, her hand brushing against Henry's, and he held it, the warmth between them a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. They watched as Lucas looked up at the sky, fascinated by the movement of the clouds, his tiny fingers reaching out as if trying to grasp the endless blue above him. Back at home, Henry continued his work at the hospital, but with a new sense of purpose. His once sterile office now featured a framed photo of Lucas, taken during one of their afternoons in the park. It was a small change, but to Henry, it signified the transformation he had undergone. He found himself connecting more deeply with his patients, taking time to understand their fears and needs, offering not just his medical skills but a newfound empathy. His colleagues noticed the shift, remarking on the softer edge to his demeanor, though they didn't know the full story behind it. One evening, as Henry returned home, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass door of the nursery. He saw a man who had faced his own fears, who had learned to open his heart despite the risks, and who had found a new strength in the process. He realized that this unexpected journey, filled with challenges and unexpected joys, had reshaped him in ways he hadn't thought possible. As he walked into the nursery to find Emma rocking Lucas to sleep, he felt a wave of contentment, knowing that his life now held a meaning he hadn't believed in before. Later, the three of them sat on the porch, watching the sky transition from golden hues to deep indigo. Lucas rested in Henry's arms, his small body warm and secure, while Emma sat beside them, her head resting on Henry's shoulder. The soft murmurs of the night filled the air as the stars began to twinkle above. Henry looked at the small, imperfect family they had become and felt a joy that was both gentle and profound. It wasn't the life he had once imagined, but it was real, and it was enough. As he glanced down at Lucas, who drifted off to sleep with a contented sigh, Henry realized that he had found a new beginning, one built on love, hope, and the unexpected beauty of second chances. In the gentle light of a new morning, Henry, Emma, and Lucas strolled along a quiet path through the park, a sense of peace settling over them. Henry held Lucas close to his chest, the baby's tiny fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt as he cooed softly, eyes wide with curiosity at the world around him. Emma walked beside them, her hand lightly brushing against Henry's as they moved in step. The morning air was crisp, and the leaves rustled softly in the trees above, creating a melody that matched the rhythm of their footsteps. It was a scene of quiet contentment, the kind of moment Henry had never thought he would cherish. As they reached a clearing, Henry paused, turning to look down at Lucas, whose sleepy eyes blinked up at him. Emma wrapped an arm around Henry's back, resting her head against his shoulder, and together they watched as a gentle breeze stirred the leaves, casting dappled shadows across the path. The past seemed distant now, replaced by the quiet promise of the future they were building together. For the first time, Henry felt truly at peace, no longer haunted by what he had lost, but instead grateful for what he had found. He kissed the top of Lucas's head, sharing a quiet smile with Emma as they stood there, a small family framed by the promise of a new day and the limitless possibilities it held.